This is Steve Zeltzer, and today I'm with two transit workers in New York MTA who face the brunt of not only the conditions, the deteriorating conditions, health and safety of the COVID, but also a recent attack that took place in the subways. And joining us are John Ferretti, he's Local 100 Fightback, an MTA worker who's also a member of TW 100, and Anthony Steiniger, who is also a TW 100 and with Fightback 100. And they're both on the ground dealing with the conditions and the problems that transit workers face. So welcome to the show. And Anthony, why don't you talk about what happened that day and the dangers and the failure really to deal with the safety hazards by management?
Well, before I get into talking about the incident and my experiences, I want to express condolences to the victims and the victims' families. And I hope to God and that the victims get whatever they need as far as counseling and medical care so that they can be made whole again. But my experience that day was I was on my way to work, and I usually get on the train, the D train, which stops at 36th Street, around about 9:10, 9:15 sometime in Manhattan. And that would be about a half hour or and trains were being rerouted. And so I looked on the MTA app that I have on my phone, and it said that there was some sort of investigation at 36th Street. It didn't say what it was, didn't say, exactly what had happened. So I spoke to the conductor on the train I was riding, and it was a passenger that informed us via, their cell phone and their the news app that they had, that it was an actual shooting there. The NTA was actually at that time, some 30 minutes after the attack, was telling employees that it was a smoke condition, or some sort of FDNY, NYPD investigation. So employees really had no idea that this horrendous attack had occurred. So by the time I did finally get to 95th Street, I had to take an Uber, which the prices were exorbitant. They price gouged everyone in South Brooklyn that day.
And Uber is price surging on a catastrophe, making money on a catastrophe. Yeah. That's Uber.
Yeah, it was $42 to go from Fifth Avenue and 9th Street in Brooklyn to 4th Avenue and 95th Street in Brooklyn. It was ridiculous. Fortunately, I spoken to someone who was going in the same direction as I was, and we split the fare. But it was just ridiculous. It was horrendous. All the bus stops were packed. The buses were jam packed with people. As far as management's failure, one of my coworkers remarked earlier today that we spend every year we go to a right to know refresher, where we as train operators and conductors learn about handling hazardous materials, but we're not refreshed on handling something that is like this, which is likely to occur, an emergency situation. We receive that training not as often as we should. The last time I remember going to some sort of training that would actually help us deal with this was several years ago, when it should be, every year, every 2 years at minimum, for train operators, conductors, cleaners, station personnel, anyone that is dealing directly with the public should have proper training on how to deal with an emergency situation. I also want to give all, credit to my coworkers on the R train, that train that pulled up beside that train where this madman was, whose quick thinking possibly could have saved lives. And to everyone who was in that station, who actually, took action to help people evacuate, get away from the area, all those people, they deserve the utmost, praise and thanks for helping to create, to minimize the damage that happened that day.
And we're talking with Anthony Steiniger, who's a
Steiniger.
Steiniger, sorry.
Steiniger. Okay. We're talking with Anthony Steiniger, who is a transit worker and was in that area where this attack took place. And also joining us is John Ferretti. And John, the mayor has said that there's an issue of guns, that's the problem. Who's responsible for this kind of thing? It's a continuing thing of attacks on transit, on people in the streets. I mean, it really is getting out of control.
Well, it's been out of control for decades. I mean, to be honest, like transit workers know when they're told to signal en route for police, that just means shut up and suffer in silence. That's what it means. Because the police don't even know the signal. When the signal is supposed to be, was it three? Anthony, it's
one long,
one short. Yeah, one long buzzer, one short buzzer is supposed to be a signal to police for police assistance. You can't find a police officer in the New York City area that knows what the hell that means. So it's useless to us. So when rail control, our bosses tell us to signal en route for police. Basically, they mean keep the train moving, and it's your problem. Deal with it. And we've had a long history of transit worker assaults, a long history of transit workers being the Dutch boy with their finger in the dikes, trying to keep things running in this entire system, even during COVID. And basically, I used to joke to coworkers that we're basically a mobile social service unit without any social services, and that's basically what has been the case for decades. COVID just ripped the gaping wound off of that problem that's been going on in society for a long time. What we have is complete and total social dysfunction. And the reason why we have that is because we don't tax the rich to pay for the services that are really necessary to solve the problems that we face. Problems of mental issues with mental health, a lack of a punitive approach to everything. The solution for everything is more cops. We spend $10 billion a year as a city on policing, yet their solve rate is like less than 30%. The cops that were on the scene on that day at 25th Street on that train that they saved all those customers to get them to 25th Street away from the shooting scene. You have injured customers shot. And what is the response of the police officer? Oh, call 911, my radio doesn't work. My radio doesn't work. Well, Anthony, what would be the response of our bosses if we said our radio didn't work, right? They were going on us. Our faces would be plastered all over the media. These incompetent workers let people die because they didn't follow New York City Transit's rules. So, I mean, look, it's a much bigger problem than just one solution. The cameras in the station didn't work. MTA went out and lied last September. They said they wired every station, all 472 subway stations, to be videotaped 24 hours a day in case just an incident like this happens. Then they got caught with their pants down and they got exposed because none of the cameras worked in the station. And what's the response? Oh, well, those three cameras don't work. So all the other cameras work. All the millions and millions of dollars were spent to wire this with God knows what kind of corrupt contract, but only those three don't work. So, this is an ongoing social collapse that's been going on for a long time. And it's because the ruling class runs society, because the ruling class starves our communities to the things that we need to prevent these kind of tragedies from happening.
And in other countries, you go to Japan, you go to Korea, you go to Europe, and the stations are beautiful. The transit systems are well kept. And yet in a city with billionaires, many, many billionaires, New York City, they can't even keep a transit system proper. The Democrats are in charge in New York, aren't they? Don't you have a Democratic mayor and a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature? Aren't they? Apparently, the billionaires are off the table as far as taking their money and using it for basically keeping the transit system going properly.
Well, I mean, you got to understand that the Democratic Party is just as corrupt as the Republican Party and is in the pocket of billionaires and has been for decades. Kathy Hochul just passed a $220 billion budget that gives $800 million to a stadium for billionaires in Buffalo. And guess who owns the concessions for the stadium? Her husband. Her daughter is a lobbyist for Big Pharma. She's taken money from every developer in the entire state, takes money from dirty energy companies. So the thing is, like, the Democrats or Republicans, it really doesn't matter because the corruption is the same in terms of that. That hasn't changed for decades.
Except the social crisis is growing the same in California with tens of thousands of homeless people in the streets, people not being able to get health care. The Governor Gavin Newsom refused to have single payer in the midst of a pandemic. People are now being charged to go to the hospital for COVID cases. Seems like we're at a breaking point and that working people and the unions need to respond to this. What's the response of the TWU and the unions in New York?
Nothing.
Well,
Nothing.
I mean, it's laughable if I'm being kind.
Yeah.
Their response was to
endorse Hochul.
So endorse Hochul and all the corruption, by the way. And by the way, her lieutenant governor just got arrested on federal charges for bribery and corruption. So the day before he gets arrested, they go out and endorse her. Great timing, guys. But corruption loves corruption, right? But the response of the union so far has been to engage in a $50,000 reward for getting the perpetrator. And who do they get the $50,000 from? They share the wealth between themselves and the NYPD police fund. So here's a union that gets $35 million a year for our dues. And all they can afford is $25,000. And the only way they want to do it is if they could suck up a little more to the NYPD. And basically what they've done has been nothing but an appendage of Mayor Adams. And Mayor Adams is a sadist. He's a piece of shit. He's a heartless bastard who doesn't care about homeless people. He wants to break up encampments. They're stealing their medicine. They're stealing their personal possessions. And they're just engaging in another form of vicious attack, which is what the cops always do in the name of solving the crisis. And they're doing it at the behest of Wall Street, because all of the people who are pressuring Adams to break up these encampments, to kick them out of the subways, are all the Grand Central Partnership, all these bougie partnerships to try to further gentrify the city and make the poor unwelcome.
And that sounds like San Francisco, the gentrification of the cities, moving of working class, Black, brown people. Anthony, you have the similar sentiments about what the union response has been to the social crisis and the conditions on the subways.
Well, I'm going to bring it back 100 years and talk about, the beginnings of unions. And what we're seeing now is that unions began basically as instruments of social change, and what we have now is just bureaucracy. And the response that they've had now with this crisis, with the COVID crisis, with the current shooting, with all of the things that are going on, the homeless crisis has been in service to the ruling class and the billionaires. Transit could be fully funded. We could have homeless services, and when you talked about, John had mentioned, mental health care, but mental health care is health care, period. We need a healthcare system in this country that covers everybody and every health issue, which we don't have. And our union isn't pushing for it. And not many unions are. Not many of your entrenched unions are pushing for that as hard as they can be. And when you talk about the Democratic Party, we just endorsed Kathy Hochul. The Democrats have been in power in our state for decades, really. And in Washington, they recently, in the last election, the last presidential election, the last congressional election, they took control of both the Senate, the House, and the executive branch. And yet we haven't seen any real legislation come forth that would solve these problems. There is no real push to tax the wealthy. And when, like John was talking about how, the wealthy should be paying for these services because they're the ones who benefit the most from it. What the opposite is actually occurring on many fronts, where, fares always on the rise. And the TA is always borrowing money from these big banks and institutions. And that money gets paid back through our tax subsidies of mass transit and through our paying fares. And then they want to increase the burden on the workers by making us work longer for less money. Each and every contract time, this is what happens. I've been here 15 years, and this is what happens. So what you're seeing is the slow erosion of what used to be a middle class in this country, because it's happening all over and everywhere. Now, the only place we're seeing, well, not the only place, but I should say one of the more notable places we're seeing where what unionism is supposed to be is with Amazon. And that was from the ground up union organizing. And it was the workers themselves who took it upon themselves to organize and unionize. And our union right now is not that way. I mean, I could get into many details of how they subvert democracy within the union, hiring their cronies for positions, not putting people in the field where they're needed. Most of the incidents happen. Einstein once said, if nothing moves, nothing happens. And where things are moving is in subways and buses. That's where we need representation. That's where we need union people to be on the ground, boots on the ground, in the field, dealing with everything that we're dealing with. And we don't have that. Instead, you have these guys' cronies tucked away in some office somewhere. And nothing's being done. You can speak to almost any transit worker, at least in my department, that moves the subways, and they'll tell you the same thing. It's horrible.
Steve, you're muted.
Yeah.
Okay, we're talking with Anthony Steiniger and John Ferretti. And John, you were involved yourself in helping the Amazon workers, Chris Small, in that organizing effort, and you broadcast their rallies that they were having. Are you surprised about their victory?
I mean, I don't think anybody who's honest can say they weren't surprised. I mean, they were going up against the second richest man in the world, a vicious, brutal billionaire, another racist piece of shit, Jeff Bezos, who said that Chris was unintelligent and didn't speak so well. And, they wanted to have it be a battle between them and Chris Smalls. Well, I think they're reconsidering that when they kick their ass. And the Amazon workers, Amazon labor union is on the march to kicking their ass all over this country, because every Amazon warehouse in this country has contacted the ALU, and it's a great and inspiring step forward. But Anthony was talking about our union, like and Steve, you were saying, it seems like the crisis is getting worse and worse, and there's no response, right? Well, part of that is the institutions of our class collaborators with our enemies, and have basically betrayed people like Chris Smalls. How the fuck is Chris Smalls, somebody who's being recruited to management in Amazon, somebody who's being recruited to the first level of management, who's supposed to oversee the exploitation of his coworkers and couldn't do it, helps lead the spark that explodes a struggle that can threaten the behemoth of the world economy? And yet this union, who runs a major American city, can't bother to get up off its ass and know which side of the goddamn picket lines to be on. They're a disgrace to the name of unionism, and every union in New York State deserves the same scorn and criticism because they engaged in massive malpractice. What would have happened if they would have been successful in silencing Chris? If they arrested him, trumped him up on charges, and threw him in Rikers Island or God knows where else in order to teach him a lesson? And the labor union didn't do anything to stand up. The AFL-CIO didn't do anything to stand up. So, we have to start to think about, what does it mean to be a union? The union is the members. Chris, what Chris's greatest attribute is? He listens to the membership. He doesn't ask them to do something that he's not willing to do, that he hasn't done 1,000 times. That's the kind of leadership that we need to build, working class leadership. And in order to do that, the unions need to grow roots in the working class. They need to understand that their role is not to speak for the working class, but to amplify the voices of the working class. And that's what Chris did so effectively. And
when the time comes and they do go on strike, it seems like the labor movement, the rest of the union should have 100,000 workers surround these warehouses. In other words, the organization of the working class in the 30s wasn't by the NLRB or appealing to the government or the bosses. It was by general strikes and mass mobilization. And this warehouse, if it's surrounded by 20, 30,000 workers from throughout New York, that will force the bosses to kneel.
Yes.
And that's, I think, what workers probably should be organizing in their unions now to do, to get ready to make sure they have a successful union struggle when they go on strike.
Absolutely. And you know, Chris is
Yep.
already reaching out nationwide to labor union members and those who want to form unions to try to build the grassroots kind of response that we need. And the reason why he has to do that is because he cannot count on anybody from who's supposed to lead. Just like the police officers are bad at their jobs when it comes to terrorism, the union bureaucracy in this country is atrociously bad at their jobs and cannot be counted on to actually think ahead and to build and use the resources of our unions to actually make sure struggles win. So unfortunately, workers are in the position of having to do it themselves, much like we were during COVID. And it's not too surprising that Chris's struggle and the AOU comes directly out of COVID. The Starbucks workers' struggles, a lot of those struggles comes directly out of the way they were treated, like their lives didn't matter during this crisis.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for both of you for joining us. And obviously, the lessons of this attack that harm people, that harm workers, that harm the community, that harm the public, obviously has not been learned by the people who run the transit system. And unfortunately, the response of the unions has been inadequate, as you say.
Thank you much for having us, Steve.